Sit still for a moment and try to catch the scene. One thought ends. What you'll eat tonight, maybe, or a name you were reaching for, and another begins. There is a gap in there. And what your brain does in that gap is not rest, and not silence. It lights up harder than it did during the thought itself, running a network that only switches on when you appear to be doing nothing. But here is the part that unravels the tidy answer. That gap is not empty, and it is not really a gap. The thing you experience as a clean cut between two thoughts is a story your brain writes afterward, stitched over machinery you were never allowed to see. Which means the question hides a stranger one. If the gap is manufactured, who is doing the manufacturing? And where were you while it happened? Start with what can actually be measured. In 2001, a neurologist named Marcus Raichle at Washington University in St. Louis noticed something that annoyed him. He was studying brains doing tasks, reading, counting, watching, and he kept needing a baseline, a picture of the brain doing nothing, to compare against. But the doing nothing scans refused to go quiet. A specific set of regions, the medial prefrontal cortex behind your forehead, the posterior cingulate cortex deep in the middle, the angular gyrus on each side, burned metabolic fuel at a high, steady rate whenever the person had no task at all. The moment a task began, those regions dimmed. Raichle called it the default mode network, and the name stuck because it captured the offense of it. This is what your brain defaults to when you stop asking it to do anything. So the gap between two thoughts is where the default mode network takes over. That is the plain answer. But if you stop there, you'll walk away with exactly the wrong picture. The picture of a brain idling at a red light. Because the default mode network isn't idling. It is doing some of the most expensive work you do all day. And most of it is about you. What is it building in there? A self. When those regions light up in the gap, the content is remarkably consistent across thousands of scans, autobiographical memory, imagining the future, modeling what other people are thinking, replaying a conversation, rehearsing one that hasn't happened. The gap between thoughts is where your brain leaves the present tense and goes to work on the character it calls me. Which raises a question that should make you slightly uneasy. If the self is something assembled in the pauses, what are you the rest of the time? Now, before this tips into mysticism, let me be careful, because the honest state of this science is messier than the confident version you'll hear elsewhere. The claim that the default mode network is the self is too clean. Some researchers, including people who've spent careers inside these scans, argue it's better described as the brain's simulation engine, a system for constructing scenarios, of which the self is just the most frequent one. The disagreement is real, and it isn't settled. What nearly everyone accepts is narrower and stranger. The pause you experience as blankness is one of the busiest states your cortex enters. Here is a physical way to hold it. Think of a theater between two shows. The audience has left, the stage looks dark and empty, and if you glanced in you'd say nothing is happening. But behind the curtain the crew is moving flats, resetting props, checking the next scene against the script, arguing quietly about a cue. The stage looks like a gap. The gap is the busiest room in the building. Your conscious attention is the audience. It only sees the lit stage, the single thought under the spotlight. It never sees the crew. And the default mode network is the crew. So why can't you feel it? Why does the gap feel like nothing from the inside when the machinery says it's a storm? Because attention has a spotlight, and the spotlight has a fixed size. This is not a metaphor I'm stretching. It's measurable. Your conscious awareness can hold roughly one train of thought at a time, and whatever it isn't pointed at doesn't register as absent. It registers as nothing at all. There's a phenomenon vision scientists call the attentional blink. Flash two targets at someone in quick succession, less than half a second apart, and they'll reliably miss the second one. Not see it dimly, but fail to see it entirely, and swear nothing was there. Their brain processed it. Electrodes catch the response. The person reports a gap. The gap is a reporting failure, not an event. That's the recognition I want you to sit with, because you've lived it. Have you ever driven somewhere familiar and arrived with no memory of the drive? 15 minutes gone. You stopped at the lights, you changed lanes, you did all of it, and there's a hole where the experience should be. That wasn't absence. Your default mode network had the wheel, while your reportable attention went somewhere else entirely. The gap between thoughts and the gap in that drive are the same phenomenon at different scales. You were never not there. You just weren't the one taking notes. Which brings the harder question forward. If your brain can run 15 minutes of competent behavior and leave no record, how much of your ordinary day is actually being witnessed by the you who thinks it's in charge? Let me pull in something from a completely different field, because it reframes the whole thing. In video game engineering, there's a technique called occlusion culling. A game world might contain an entire city, but the machine can only render a fraction of it at once without choking. So the engine does something ruthless. It only draws what the camera is currently pointed at. Turn around, and the street behind you doesn't dim. It stops existing, computationally, until you look back. The world feels continuous and total to the player. It is nothing of the kind. It is a thin shell of now, generated just ahead of where you're looking, discarded the instant you look away. Your experience runs on occlusion culling. The gap between two thoughts is a stretch of world the engine chose not to render, because the camera of attention wasn't pointed there. And the continuity you feel, the sense that your mind is a smooth, unbroken stream, is the same illusion the game gives the player. The seams are hidden not because there are no seams, but because the system that would notice them is the same system doing the hiding. If that just tilted something for you, and there's a layer coming underneath this that's stranger still, about time itself bending inside the gap, subscribe now, because that section is a few minutes out, and it's the reason I built this whole thing. So how long is the gap, really? This is where it stops being comfortable. You'd assume the pause between thoughts is a tiny slice of time, a few hundred milliseconds, a breath. But the brain doesn't measure the gap in seconds. It measures it in content, and then it lies to you about the seconds. Here's the evidence. Benjamin Libet, a physiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, ran a set of experiments in the 1980s that people are still arguing about. He asked people to flick their wrist whenever they felt like it, and to note the exact instant they consciously decided to move, using a fast-moving clock. Meanwhile, he recorded the electrical buildup in their motor cortex, a signal called the readiness potential. The result landed like a slap. The readiness potential began about half a second before the person reported deciding. The brain committed to the movement, and only afterward did the feeling of, "I chose this now," get stitched in, backdated, so it felt like it came first. I want to be straight with you about this one, because Libet's work gets wildly overstated. You'll hear people say it proves free will is an illusion. It doesn't prove anything that grand. The timing of a conscious report is a notoriously slippery thing to measure, and later researchers have shown the readiness potential might just be background noise crossing a threshold, not a decision being made. The strong claim is inflated, but the narrow finding survives every critique, and the narrow finding is enough to unsettle you. The moment you experience as the present is not live. It's assembled. Your sense of now arrives after the fact, edited into place, time-stamped to feel immediate. So think about what that does to the gap. The pause between two thoughts isn't a window you're looking through in real time. It's a cut in a film you're watching slightly after it was shot. And film editors have a name for what happens when you cut between two shots. The persistence of vision that makes 24 still images per second feel like continuous motion. Your mind is doing the same trick with thoughts, discrete flickers of processing, and a rendering system that smears them into a stream. The gap is the black frame between cells. You never see it, because seeing it would require a second observer watching the first one, and there isn't one. There is only the film, insisting it was always moving. Have you ever had a word on the tip of your tongue? You know that you know it. You can feel its shape, its rhythm, maybe its first letter, but the word itself won't come. Sit with what that state actually is. It's a gap with edges. You're experiencing the outline of a thought that hasn't rendered yet. That sensation, the presence of an absence, the knowing without the content, is the closest you will ever come to standing inside the gap and feeling the crew work before the curtain rises. Most people have felt that 1,000 times and never once realized they were looking straight at the machinery. Now let me take you deeper, because there's a level below the timing, and it's about identity. If the self gets rebuilt in the gaps, does the same self come back each time? Consider what happens across a genuinely long gap: sleep. Every night, for stretches of it, the default mode network quiets, and the continuous you simply is not running. There is no experiencer in dreamless sleep. And then in the morning, something reassembles, opens its eyes, and assumes without a flicker of doubt that it is the same person who lay down. What's the evidence for that assumption? Memory. A chain of recollection that says yesterday connects to today. But the chain is built by the same default mode network that goes offline every night. You are trusting the record keeper's word that the records are continuous, when the record keeper itself was unconscious for the gap it's vouching for. Here's a physical model for that, borrowed from something you'd never connect to the mind, a river. You point at a river and say, "That's the Thames," as if you're naming a thing. But there is no thing. Every molecule of water you're looking at will be in the North Sea by tomorrow. The Thames is not the water, it's the shape the water keeps flowing through. The banks, the bends, the pattern that persists while the substance completely replaces itself. You are not the thoughts, you are the shape the thoughts keep flowing through, the pattern that reasserts itself after every gap. And a pattern is not a thing. A pattern is an agreement to be treated as one. If any of that reorganized something for you, if the river or the black frame between cells is going to stay with you, hit like. It's the one signal that pushes this in front of someone else who's been assuming their mind was a solid, continuous object. So what fills the gap, if not you? This is where I have to admit the edge of what's known, because past a certain point the science thins, and the honest thing is to say so. We can watch the default mode network light up. We can measure the timing offsets. We can show that continuity is constructed. What we cannot do, what nobody can currently do, is say why any of it is accompanied by experience at all. Why isn't the gap just dark machinery, occlusion culling with nobody home to be fooled? The philosopher David Chalmers named this the hard problem of consciousness in 1995, and 3 decades on it is exactly as unsolved as the day he named it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to give you a tidy ending. The gap between two thoughts is one of the places that problem lives, plainly visible, refusing to open. But sit with what we can say, because it's enough to change how the next hour feels. The gap is not a pause in you. The gap is where you are made. The continuous self you take for granted is the least continuous thing about you. It is rebuilt, thought by thought, from a network that runs hardest when you seem to be doing nothing, and the seams are hidden by the very system that would have to notice them. You have never experienced two thoughts in a row. You have only ever experienced the illusion of no space between them. There's one more turn, and it's the one I find hardest to shake. We've been treating the gap as the villain, the hidden seam, the unlit frame, the thing being covered up. But run it the other way. Meditators from traditions that predate every scan I've mentioned spent thousands of years trying to do one specific thing: widen the gap. Not to fill it with a better thought, but to rest in the space between, to make the pause long enough to actually inhabit. When modern researchers put experienced practitioners in scanners, work done at the University of Wisconsin under Richard Davidson, among others, they found something consistent. The default mode network in these practitioners was quieter, less grabby, less prone to yanking attention back into the story of me. They hadn't eliminated the gap. They'd stopped letting the crew hide behind the curtain. They'd learned to watch the theater reset. And I'd wager some of you have brushed against that without any training at all. A moment where a thought ended and the next one just didn't come, and for a second there was awareness with nothing in it, and it felt less like absence and more like the widest thing you'd ever felt. I'm genuinely curious whether I'm right about that, or whether I'm the only one. Which leaves the question I can't answer for you, and won't pretend to. If the self is assembled in the gaps, and the gaps can be widened, and inside the widened gap the self grows quiet, then what is doing the watching when the watcher steps back? Something is still there. Something notices the quiet. It isn't the default mode network. That's the thing that went silent. It isn't a thought. There are no thoughts. There's just awareness, aware of its own gap, with no self in it, and no one apparently missing. Tell me in the comments, have you ever caught a moment like that? A gap that opened on its own, with awareness in it and no you in the middle. Be honest, even if you can't find the words. Especially then. Share this with the one person you know who's most convinced they are a single, solid, continuous thing, because they're the one who most needs to feel the floor move. I don't have the bottom of this for you. Nobody does. What I can tell you is what to do with it tonight, which is nothing, and everything. The next time one thought ends and you notice the pause before the next, don't fill it. Just look at it. That black frame between the cells of your mind is running the projector. And the strangest possibility of all is the one I keep circling back to and can't put down. that the gap isn't the space between you and the next thought. The gap might be the only place you've ever actually been.